here in the office, and we're going to run through some slides on this next unit, Modernism. Yes, we have finally reached the modern era in English 252. I've put together three, I think, pretty insightful quotes on modernism by three figures of the modernist period: Henry Adams, Virginia Woolf, Willa Cather. And if you read these quotes about this period, you can really sense the anxiety and the disillusionment, the disconnected or fragmented perception of this most volatile and really transformational period. The first one is by Henry Adams. He was the great-grandson of John Adams and the grandson of John Quincy Adams. In 1900, Henry Adams writes, "The continuity snapped." Wow. Right? I mean, that gives you a little sense of a sort of the earthquake revolutionary period of Western civilization, sort of a decay, a crumbling of it. On or about 1910, human character changed. This one by Virginia Woolf. You may be familiar with this modernist novelist, Virginia Woolf. She was British, probably best known for a novel called To the Lighthouse, okay, or Mrs. Dalloway. And then Willa Cather. Oh, I love some Willa Cather. I love this quote, too. "The world broke in two in 1922, or thereabouts." Oh, I think this sets the stage for some of these writers and some of these ideas that we're going to get into. I can't wait. So we're going to look at some definitions of modernism. We're going to look at the dates and present to you some of the characteristics and maybe some examples of modernism as we begin this new period. Any number of ways and any number of examples from people much smarter than I am about modernism. But I like this as a simple and rather I think a good working definition of modern. The term modern, when we apply it to American literature, is applied to writing that is marked by a strong and conscious break with traditional forms and techniques of expression. I like to think of modernism as, quote, the earthquake of the arts. By 1900, a new America and a new Western civilization were beginning to emerge. This was a period that was marked by rapid change. We saw the advancing technologies, new industries, new insights offered by people like Freud into the human psyche, and an ever-expanding cities throughout America. There was great excitement, but with that excitement, the underpinning or the underside of that excitement, it was tempered and marked by great anxiety, spiritual uncertainty, and questions everywhere. To respond to the New Age, artists sought new approaches, new forms, and new techniques. It is this new quest to be new and a quest for the new. This quest, this restless experimentation that most marks modern art in its various forms. All right, let's talk about some dates for this literary period. Most literary historians will date the modernist period as the period from 1915 to 1945. Now, at its widest range, modernism can be dated from 1900 to 1945. Some mark the beginning at 1909. Some will mark it as late as 1915. The beginning periods of really any literary period are always a little problematic because, as I've mentioned before, writers don't wake up on January 1st of a particular year and decide, hey, today we're going to be modernists, or today we're going to be realists, or now I'm a postmodern. So it's rather, I think, narrow-minded to try to pinpoint the beginning of a period. What we're more interested in looking at is widespread changes that are detectable, trends that we can see emerging during a certain period, right? I mean, if we think about what we've studied already, look, we've already seen two poets, principally Walt Whitman and Emily Dickinson, who, for all intents and purposes, really were writing with a modernist sensibility. And they were writing, in the middle of the 19th century, right? Irving Howe captures the modernist sensibility this way. The modern writer can no longer accept the claims of the world. The usual morality seems counterfeit, taste a genteel indulgence, and tradition a wearisome fetter. So this morning I simply want to give you some sense of the way that artists responded to this period. That is to say, some characteristics of modernism to be on the lookout for in the authors and the texts ahead. Probably the single most prominent characteristic of this period was the period's experimentation. Modernists are daringly original artists, and they are searching always for new forms of expression, forms that correspond to the changing of the age. It reflected a new, more technological age. There were revelations that took place in human psychology and in morality and sexuality, and poetry becomes certainly more dense and perhaps a bit obtuse at times, and it can be fraught with symbolism. And that symbolism can be a little more difficult to interpret and to sort of process. Generally speaking, as I said, the modernist artists, they're reacting against the previous period. So they strove to be daringly original, searching for new forms of expression. Ezra Pound, one of the period's most significant modernist experimenters, Ezra Pound's call to, quote, make it new, and Gertrude Stein's credo, quote, break it up, suggests this bold aesthetic view of experimentation. In poetry, this led to, as I said, dense symbolism. We'll see in the poetry of Ezra Pound a period known as imagism. There is dramatic monologue in free verse, as we'll see in writers like T.S. Eliot. In the novel, as a form, it led to stream of consciousness instead of traditional linear narratives. We see experimentation, though, in all of the art forms. We see it in the Cubist movement, in the visual paintings, visual arts, and in the compositions of Tchaikovsky. We also recall the radical work being done in psychology by individuals, figures such as Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. Disillusionment, right? This generation of writers, these modernists, now I know I'm painting them here with a rather broad brush, but for the most part, when we think about modernists, we think of them as a generation of intellectuals and artists who rejected the social and economic, political, spiritual values of Western culture. We must remember that these artists were exactly that. They were artists. They were intellectuals, many of them, who felt so betrayed by the institutions that led their generation, their world, into the First World War. That war that was to end all wars. The wars that took 7.6 million lives, you guys. Now, 7.6 million lives, that's hard to get your head around, but that's the equivalent of, well, if we took everybody in the combined Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex and combined that with all of the Atlanta metroplex, we'd get roughly 7.6 million, 8 million people. The English they essentially lost an entire generation of young men. And these were the best and the brightest of Britain. So for so many of these intellectuals and artists, they were just, again, so fundamentally just shook and disillusioned and jaded and disenchanted by this, by their predecessors, by these values and these structures of institutions that had led them really into this most chaotic and destructive period. We see during the modernist period the rise of a philosophy known as existentialism. Existentialism suggests that the universe is somehow without God, that there is essentially no fixed meaning to the human condition and human experience, or for that matter, even human history. Existentialists would suggest that perhaps individuals may or may not have any meaning to their lives. So this marks a profound shift, really, in traditional philosophical and religious systems. Now, this may seem so peculiar or foreign to you, but we must look at this period and this generation as a generation that had lived through, again, this cataclysmic existential period of World War I. And I don't think really any of us living today can even begin to conceptualize the psychological, philosophical, and spiritual consequences of this world at war. This period, remember, World War I is 1914 to 1918. So you can understand perhaps that this was a period that, because of its chaotic nature, led so many individuals to begin questioning really the existence, their own existence, or begin questioning the meaning of not only their lives, but the lives of all human beings. Yet another significant characteristic of most modernist art, and particular modernist literature, is alienation. American modernists, the artists themselves, felt like outsiders within their own culture. So, as a result, European residences and experimentation resulted. In fact, many searched for their own forms. They would prefer to search for their own and develop their own unique patterns and forms than tapping into or mimicking traditional forms that had historically been viewed as acceptable in their cultures. We see the psychological state sometimes being so disrupted, so confounded, that they really cannot be adequately expressed and recorded in traditional forms. And again, because so many of America's writers became disillusioned with America, they left. They simply became expatriates, establishing literary colonies in cities like Paris, London, and Rome. They felt like outsiders here in America. To combat this, they simply left. And I'm talking about writers like T.S. Eliot, Ezra Pound, Robert Frost, Ernest Hemingway, F. Scott Fitzgerald. These were the avant-garde, in other words, the advanced guard. Gertrude Stein referred to Ernest Hemingway and Fitzgerald and this group of Parisian expatriates as members of a lost generation. Another characteristic, chiefly of modernist poetry, is the profound and very discernible element of control. Modernist poetry is marked by this. It's particularly precise, extraordinarily crafted and recrafted. We get the sense that these poets are truly, truly crafting a poetic form that precisely matches their very highly individualistic, idiosyncratic sense of expression. In other words, whatever it is that they are feeling internally and seeking to express, they will create a form, a precise form that will best suit the expression or the concept or idea they are trying to convey. And this really reaches its zenith with the imagist poetry that was written by poets such as Ezra Pound, William Carlos Williams, Amy Lowell, Hilda Doolittle, etc. Those of you who are studying maybe a psychology course may be familiar with these terms. We've already talked a little bit about Sigmund Freud, but there was another fellow by the name of Carl Jung, and his major contribution to psychology was this concept of the shadow self, the concept of universal archetypes. And just as we saw with the naturalist writers who were deeply influenced by thinkers such as Charles Darwin and Sigmund Freud, poets likewise were inspired by the imaginations and by the work of these prominent, two probably most prominent psychologists of the early 20th century, Sigmund Freud and Carl Jung. I just want to speak briefly about the concept of classical antiquity and the modernists. So, as I mentioned a few slides ago, this group of intellectuals, this group of artists were deeply disillusioned and frustrated by the previous generation, right? The generation of their parents, and we could even say their grandparents. In other words, recent history, right? Because they felt as though it was the past and most recent generations that really had led the modernist generation to the brink of destruction, to the brink of World War I, right? Where for probably the first time ever, people began to question or began raising the concept of human beings actually being capable of destroying themselves. So what did they do? Instead of, again, seeking inspiration and solace from their immediate previous generations, you'll see sometimes, particularly if you read the poetry of T.S. Eliot and Ezra Pound, and H.D. Hilda Doolittle, you'll see them actually drawing inspiration from classical antiquity. In other words, they go way back, right? Not recent history, but they begin looking really back to the dawn of civilization, and you see them evoking and making references and allusions to the Greek and Roman civilizations and cultures. I'll try to draw your attention to some of that if we encounter any of that. But it's just kind of an interesting idea. And I think one of the reasons they do it is because those Greek and Roman cultures and civilizations, they really did represent really sort of a golden era of philosophy, of literature, of architecture, right? Of religion and politics. If you think about the great Roman orators, right, and the concepts of that they imbued into the civilization and their contributions. And so I think that's why they're sort of intrigued by them, because they're looking really in their most immediate rear view mirror, and they're looking at how they were let down. And so I think that's why they're drawn to the antiquity of those classical eras of the Greek and Roman civilizations, because I think part of them's wondering, like, how did we go from the Greek and Roman civilizations to where we are now, basically a world that is collapsing underneath us, right? A world that seems to be crumbling, all of its infrastructure, the widespread destruction of human life and culture. That's kind of a neat idea. Another characteristic, not a major characteristic, but certainly one that is maybe worth mentioning and spending just a moment on, is this concept of primitivism, just in the same way that so many of these modernists were disillusioned with their most recent history, the most recent generations, those that they felt had betrayed them, and were subsequently inspired by the classics, like we saw on the previous slide, the Roman and the Greek cultures. We do see modernists, some of them inspired by African art and American Indian art, which really does begin to receive attention and celebration, rightfully so. I would say chief among these is this period known as the Harlem Renaissance. And we'll look at the great poetry of Langston Hughes, and we'll talk a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance more when we get to him. But certainly the Harlem Renaissance was fueled in part by a sense of pride in things African. It's good stuff. So the Harlem Renaissance, while we're on it, is such an extraordinarily rich period in this modernist period in the beginning of the 20th century. There was this resurgence, a feeling of pride in African heritage and in African American culture. Really does sort of come to the fore in that period between the world wars, between World I and World War II, in a number of American cities. Like most modernists, the artists associated with the Harlem Renaissance expressed disillusionment, all of those same characteristics, those existential questions, the feelings of alienation, but a profound disillusionment with America and its promises, and the extent to which those promises have somehow been left unfulfilled. So I thought I'd give this a try. I haven't used my document camera here, and I'm not really sure if this will be successful, but I'm going to give it a whirl because I'm a modernist. I'm going to experiment. Excuse me. I love this poem by Langston Hughes, probably one of the most important poets of the modernist period. He is mostly associated with the Harlem Renaissance, but I love this poem. The Negro speaks of rivers. I've known rivers, ancient as the world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo, and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and raised the pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. We also see in the modernist period a certain elevation and intrigue with the proletariat class. Now, that may be a new term for some of you. I recognize that. But when you hear the term proletariat, it's generally referring to the social class of wage earners. Okay, the members of society whose possession of significant economic value is their labor power. In other words, their capacity to work, to create, to produce. In fact, if you are a member of the working class, then you are a member of the proletariat class. Okay, so a proletariat are individuals associated with working class people, regarded collectively as precisely that, the proletariat. So between 1917 and World War II, we begin to see, right, because you got to remember what's going on historically during this period, you guys, right? We have this two things: the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia, the writings and philosophies advanced by Karl Marx, the ideas of communism and socialism. They promised really a new and more equitable culture to many. And in the 1930s, we see proletarian art and literature thriving in America, really for the only time. I can think of two off the top of my head here. John Dos Passos, probably a name you're not familiar with, but maybe you're familiar with the writing of and the work and life of John Steinbeck. Maybe you read of Mice and Men in school, or his best-known novel, at least, The Grapes of Wrath, right? So these were writers who were intrigued, right, by the downtrodden, by the disenfranchised workers whose lives, think about that, their lives and their families' lives, the trajectory of their lives were fundamentally and profoundly transformed by the collapse of capitalism as it happened in the late 1920s when the stock market crashes and the world, and certainly America, is plunged into the Great Depression, which mark truly that decade of the 1930s. And so we do see in modernist fiction, as I mentioned, most notably, we see writers drawn to representing and expressing the plight of the proletarian class in America. Hey, listen, if you guys have stayed with me this far, you guys deserve something. So I'm going to give you a little bit of Wallace Stevens here, and I guess the payoff for listening to this lecture is that I will put on the exam, or maybe even on a quiz, something about Wallace Stevens' poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar. And because poetry, particularly during the modernist period, is challenging, because it is so experimental. It's because, if you go back to that first slide, you guys, right, where we're talking about this this period being marked by such upheaval, by such experimentation, by such by individuals really maybe for the first time in the 20th century at least, particularly poets, expressing themselves in the newest and most modern way they knew how, by breaking from all traditions in the recent past, breaking away from those strict patterns of poetry. And so it is, I recognize that poetry during this period is really thought to be challenging and oftentimes inaccessible, because the individual reality of the artist is filtered through the poet's conscious consciousness, and it would reflect very personal, highly idiosyncratic, often complex and fragmented ideas that are being filtered through the intellect and imagination of the poet, down their arms, through their fingertips, through the pens or typewriters, right, onto the printed page. And so we get this representative modernist poet, Wallace Stevens, a little excerpt from his poem, The Man with the Blue Guitar. You guys, I don't know if you know, but I love to play guitar. I don't have a blue guitar, and I don't really want one for that matter. But Wallace Stevens has this poem. They said you have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are. The man replied, things as they are changed upon the blue guitar. Wow. So, I don't know, but just something occurs to me, just as I read this, that this is a wonderful metaphor, certainly, or perhaps, maybe not certainly, maybe nothing is certain in modernism. Maybe that's the point of modernism, right? Is that things that had been certain for centuries, for generations, had dissolved, had exploded, had been decimated, right, by Western civilization. So maybe the blue guitar is a metaphor, right, for poetry, for art. You have a blue guitar. You do not play things as they are. In other words, you don't express yourself as they are on this thing, the blue guitar, right? And the man, let's say if the speaker or the man is a stand-in for the poet, any poet of the modernist era would reply, things as they are, in other words, ruined, decimated and destroyed, right? Things as they are changed upon the blue guitar, right? In other words, I'm going to express this changed world that I am moving through and living in and don't quite understand. The world that I'm trying to make sense of, I will change it. I will react and respond to it differently through the blue guitar, right? Yeah, good stuff. Odd stuff, but it's worth exploring. Certainly worth entertaining. Hey guys, we're done. Listen, we just got, all I'm going to leave you with here are just some names, some, in this case, early American modernist poets. These are poets who were writing and living and responding to the modernist era in America during this time. We're going to be reading some Frost and some Eliot and some Langston Hughes, and we're going to be reading E.A. Robinson, Edgar Lee Masters. I think we read some H.D. as well, maybe some Edna St. Vincent Millay as well. So here are some key figures in American modernism that aren't poets. So what I've listed here are just simply some it's really important writers who were writing in fiction and drama as their primary genres. Sherwood Anderson, F. Scott Fitzgerald. We'll read a great story by F. Scott Fitzgerald called Babylon Revisited, which really does epitomize the modernist era and modernist sensibility. We're going to read some William Faulkner. We'll read some Hemingway, some Steinbeck. But here are some other ones. Willa Cather. There's a great story in our book. I don't think I have it assigned. It's called The Neighbor Rosicky. Beautiful, beautiful story. Thomas Wolfe, a fabulous writer as well from North Carolina. He lived up in Asheville, North Carolina. If you've ever read or ever traveled through that area. Susan Glaspell, boy, great writer of short fiction, very experimental, a playwright. As was Eugene O'Neill. We've got a play of his in the book. Anyway, we're going to wrap it up right here. Again, I appreciate your attentiveness and your and you're hanging around this long. So kudos to you. Hope you're enjoying this period. It's a rich period, and it's a period that is, I think, can be challenging with respect to the poetry. The stories, I don't think, are as challenging, but it's really an extraordinary period in American literature. Okay, I'll see you guys soon. Bye-bye.